Hello everyone. So in this presentation, and the title is Technologies of Justice, Accountability After Atrocity, I focus on important developments in international accountability, with particular focus on the topic in the area of transitional justice. For those of you who are perhaps not familiar with the term transitional justice, this term refers to all the policies, the mechanisms that countries emerging from violence, authoritarian rule, state repression use in order to deal with the violent legacy of their own past. And these tools may range from amnesties, truth commissions, prosecutions, apologies, or even revision of history textbooks. And one of the most significant developments since the end of the Cold War has been the global spread of international accountability. So while in the past, warlords or authoritarian leaders used to be left off the hook for their own human rights records, since the end of the Cold War, a growing number of these repressive leaders have ended up either in jail or being prosecuted for gross human rights violations. I can name only a few: Pinochet, Rios Montt, or Milosevic. So Catherine Seeking, one of the leading figures in the study of transitional justice, in 2011 wrote a very important book titled Justice Cascade. So essentially, she coined the term Justice Cascade to describe this particular phenomenon, the global spread of international accountability for human rights violations. And she attributed this important development primarily to the changing international legal norms, not exclusively, but primarily. And obviously, I would largely agree with this hypothesis, but I think it sidelines one important and, in my view, obvious point. It's the first time that science offers the tools in order to do that, in order to ensure international accountability. So my argument today is that in parallel with this broader international legal cascade, there has been a parallel forensic cascade going on, which has been to some extent underexplored in the literature. So the application, and I'm referring to the forensic cascade, to the application essentially of these instruments, these forensic instruments, which to some extent has revolutionized how societies emerging from trauma deal with the violent legacy of their own past. So in this presentation today, I focus on a very specific and I would say simple question. In what ways has this application, the application of forensic technologies, transformed how societies deal with the violent past? In effect, what has been the impact of these technologies in the evolution, historically speaking, of transitional justice? And to explore this impact, the impact of these technologies, I focus on the very crucial case, in my view, of the disappearances, the crime of disappearances. The very clandestine nature of the crime makes the study of this crime the most challenging litmus test. So if we see an impact in these clandestine crime, then it's far more likely to see also to trace impacts of these technologies in other types of crimes which are less concealed. In parallel, so apart from this, the focus on the disappeared, I also focus on an in-depth analysis of the case of Argentina, which in my view is a very important case, not least because it's one of the pioneers in the use of technologies in order to deal with human rights violations. So in some ways, it can help us trace the impact of the application of these instruments, particularly in prosecutorial in the prosecutorial strategy in different countries. So so let me proceed by, let me cut to the chase and present the argument in brief. So the paper here maps the transformative role of these technologies, and I can detect 4 different ways in which these instruments, the technologies of justice, forensic technologies, has shaped the evolution of transitional justice. The first one is obviously humanitarian exhumations. So in this path to accountability, tools are geared primarily towards addressing the most pressing humanitarian needs of the families of the victims of disappeared, as well as I will show you in a moment, their own legal right to repair. The second avenue through which these technologies has shaped the evolution of transitional justice is truth recovery. That is the application of forensic mechanisms, instruments, to reconstruct and document patterns of past human rights violations. And these mechanisms have been very important, particularly in the workings of the truth commissions. And truth commissions are very central nowadays in transitional justice. A third way through which technologies have affected the evolution of transitional justice is obviously retributive justice. That is the collection of incriminatory evidence from graves in order to support the prosecutorial strategy and bring the perpetrators to a court of law. And finally, historical justice, effectively the use of forensic evidence in order to revisit, to renegotiate a painful chapter of the national history that had remained silent in the past. And we have a growing number of countries, I will show you in a moment, like Spain or Canada, where they are now revisiting painful chapters of their own distant past. But first thing first, let me start with the humanitarian exhumations. So in the past, any effort to identify the remains or the victims of the missing or the disappeared required eyewitnesses or perpetrators to come forward and pinpoint grave sites, so where the bodies are buried. And as you can easily imagine, this was quite difficult because a lot of people were thwarted, were reluctant to share information about potential cases of homicide. And that is why it was not only difficult to recover the victims, but most importantly, it was very difficult for the families to move on. So a significant trauma remained open in most deeply divided societies. So this has left thousands of families across the world, from Sri Lanka to Colombia, or from Cyprus to Lebanon and Georgia, with some pressing questions, such as where are our loved ones? Are they buried? Are they alive? If they are buried, if they are dead, where are they buried? So without this information about the fate, the whereabouts of their loved ones, the families were trapped in a state of limbo. They couldn't move on. And as you can easily imagine, in deeply divided societies and in reconciliation processes, this is a major obstacle. So this is important because it is the first time in human history that science, technologies, forensic technologies in particular, offer novel ways in order to identify human remains with precision without necessarily having the eyewitnesses or the perpetrators' testimonies. So thousands of families across in different countries, including Cyprus, where I'm currently based, now have the opportunity in some ways to reconnect with their loved ones, provide them with a decent burial, because they can identify, these forensic experts can identify the remains of the victims and provide a decent burial. So now one may ask, obviously, is this a form of accountability? Well, I think it is, not least because it's a pressing humanitarian need of the families. And this is something that comes up in a number of studies in the field. But most importantly, because it overlaps and it can satisfy one of the most important provisions of the international legal framework around the disappeared. And it's part and parcel of the broader right to know the truth. So if one takes a look at the International Convention Against Disappearances, one can find that nowadays the right to identify and return the remains of the victims is an extension of the right to know the truth, which obviously is a form of accountability and part of the broader transparency debate in other areas of accountability, obviously. Secondly, another way through which the application of these technologies has revolutionized how we deal with issues of human rights violations is retributive justice. So in the past, a major obstacle And perhaps one of the reasons why we haven't seen this growing international accountability happening earlier is the fact that in order to prosecute those most responsible for human rights violations, these proceedings, criminal proceedings, relied almost exclusively on human testimony. And as we know, this is not as compelling evidence in a court of law. We know that human memory often is distorted after traumatic events. So it was very difficult for leaders in post-conflict societies to set up these criminal proceedings, precisely because they were not sure that they had a realistic chance of success. And success meaning having a fair trial, having compiling information and evidence that could lead to a conviction. Because as we know, the only thing that can be worse than no trials in post-conflict societies are failed trials, trials that do not stand, that do not lead to convictions or do not lead to something more concrete. So this is important because nowadays, obviously, science offers a credible way in order to collect incriminatory evidence from the grave sites, directly from the grave sites. And these are, usually they are not disputed in a court of law. It's very difficult from the defense team to dispute evidence coming from grave sites, forensic evidence. This has been an immense support for the prosecutorial authorities in different countries, not only in countries, but also as part of international criminal tribunals like the ICTY in former Yugoslavia or the ICTR in Rwanda. As we know, bones never lie, which is not exactly true, but in some ways, the testimony of forensic scientists coupled with the report that summarizes the findings from a particular gravesite is important. So if they find in a particular mass grave members of particular ethnic community being, for example, executed in a very specific way, then obviously this can support the charge of, I don't know, ethnic cleansing or a particular charge. This has been quite important also in the case of Argentina, where they faced a very unique crime. Approximately 500 babies have been stolen from their own mothers while in captivity. So they were in captivity, they were disappeared, the mothers, while they were pregnant, and they used to let them give birth to the babies and then execute them. So they were trying to find, they were carrying out a forensic exhumation of the mothers in order to find out whether these mothers gave birth before dying. And then these set in motion another process that is identifying whether the babies can be linked to the grandparents, grandmothers, and the grandfathers. So they invented, even in Argentina, they invented a grandpaternity test in order to connect these different generations. And that, in some cases, that was the starting point of the criminal proceeding. Because first of all, you need to establish that a baby has been abducted and the baby belonged to a particular mother that had disappeared. And as you can see from the extract in this interview with an Argentinian judge that we collected, you can see that DNA has revolutionized the criminal investigation all over the world. It used to take a long time to establish identity, or it used to be necessary to collect blood. Eventually, we just needed to order a search warrant and we could establish identity through the genetic material collected in toothbrush. So even collecting material from a toothbrush was helpful in terms of supporting a case in a court of law. The second way through which the prosecutorial authorities were supported by the availability of these instruments is merely by presenting the evidence in a court of law. So precisely because these cases are very complex and the judges are often not experts in the field, having forensic experts to explain in simple language what had happened was quite important. So testifying in these human rights trials, and in some ways, if I recall correctly, a judge mentioned that seeing, in inverted commas, the evidence has transformed how judges understand these cases nowadays. And finally, if you ask the so what question, does it make any difference in the likelihood of a conviction? It does. So the preliminary analysis of a number of cases, so I've analyzed approximately 75 cases related to human rights violations in Argentina. These have been split into two. Those cases that were essentially forensic, the use of forensic evidence has been part of the prosecutorial strategy, while in other cases of disappearances, it has not. And one can see that there is a clear difference in the likelihood of a conviction. So these cases were forensic evidence was a significant part of the prosecutorial strategy, was more likely to lead to a conviction. And not only that, the analysis of court rulings and the rationale of the judges, coupled with the interviews we collected, it seems that it's quite important for them in order to to satisfy the burden of proof in order to convict a particular defendant. Now, there is a third way through which the application, the availability of forensic evidence has shaped, in some ways, has historically shaped modern transitional justice, and that is truth recovery, or simply truth commissions. So now forensic scientists carry out a very important function in the broader architecture of transitional justice. They are able to reconstruct patterns of crimes, patterns of human rights violations. And this is, to some extent, the remit of activities or the mandate of truth commissions. So to some extent, they go hand in hand, the evolution of these two mechanisms, forensic science and the global diffusion of truth commissions. Nowadays, we have more than 45, if I recall correctly, truth commissions around the world. And I think, as you can see here, I have a table which shows the evolution of these commissions. And as you can see on the left-hand side, the majority of the commissions, of these fact-finding commissions, have used, as part of their own mandate, forensic investigation in order to legitimize the final report of a truth commission. So forensic scientists, they would go to detention centers, they would collect evidence, forensic evidence, in order to reconstruct how the crimes or patterns of crimes have been committed. In the absence of these evidence, then I would say once again that truth commissions would most likely fail to provide compelling evidence about the motivations, not the motivations, the patterns of human rights violations. So in some ways, the historical evolution of truth commissions and the global spread of forensic science, or the forensic tools in human rights investigations, they go hand in hand. And I think this is a dialectic relationship between the two. So it's not only that the availability of this forensic evidence has legitimized the work of truth commissions around the world, but vice versa as well. So the global spread of truth commissions has also given international reputation and more, how can I say that, legitimacy for the work of forensic scientists in human rights violation settings, in post-conflict settings. And finally, there's a fourth way through which, fourth avenue through which essentially the applicability, the application of forensic sciences has benefited, has boosted how societies deal with the violent past. And that is essentially in countries with entrenched cultures of silence and oblivion, like where essentially they didn't want to deal with the violent past. It was a culture of silence, like in Spain, I mentioned before. The use of forensic, the use of forensic sciences has been quite important. Why is that? Because it's the first time that they could literally unearth their own past by unearthing the victims of a distant chapter of their violent past, and bring it back to life. So when you have dead bodies, like in the context of the civil war in Spain, where essentially we have the generation of the grandchildren of the Republican victims of the civil war in Spain, that 70 years or 80 years now after the conclusion of the civil war, and still nowadays they are able to exhume the bodies, rebury them according to their own rituals. And this has set in motion a very powerful movement for the recovery of historical memory. So now there are broader debates about how we commemorate this chapter of our own past. And this is not limited to Spain. A number of countries from Australia to Canada, more recently, for example, in Ireland, where it's related either to indigenous people or to how the state treated particular groups, minorities within particular country. So without the availability of these instruments, it would have been much more difficult for these societies to unearth, to address this chapter of their own past, because they have hard evidence to essentially democratize the public debates around the past. And this, in some ways, is also a form of accountability. Now, as a form of conclusion, I don't want to argue, and I don't want my argument to be misconstrued. The argument here is not that technologies have been the sole driver of increased international accountability in post-conflict settings. That would be far-fetched. Rather, the argument here is that the availability of these forensic tools has presented new opportunities for local actors or for international actors, international institutions, to grapple with old dilemmas in novel ways. So it's like providing new opportunities to deal with challenging issues, but in novel ways. I think I will conclude here, but I think the main argument is that technologies has been an important element of these broader justice cascades that we observe in transitional justice, but it requires, I think, more investigation in order to understand how technologies affect decision-making at the elite level, but also how it creates new opportunities for silenced actors at the grassroots. Thank you very much.